remarks.
Very good to see you.
And you. Yeah.
Where
Are you
John?
happy? Are you happy to be recorded, John?
Yes, no problem being recorded. Yeah, as
Lovely.
I say, life is on the record, so there's no point in trying to pretend what you said you haven't said.
Where are you? Where are you, Jonathan? Are you in London?
In London, in where I've been sitting working for the last year and a half since I've stopped traveling. Finally started traveling again. Last week I got as far as Brussels, which is not very far, but somewhere.
Sarah said a couple of airlines have probably gone bankrupt from the number of flights you didn't take on them.
Yes, yeah, and I've got several million air miles on just about every airline in the world. I even have air miles on Air Koryu, which is the North Korean airline, which are not easy to spend.
Can you get a return ticket to you?
No, it's always one way, sadly.
Okay.
Imagine flying North Korean. I wouldn't. I wouldn't be that comfortable. Oh look, Rotary Club of Tiverton coming in with their crocuses. That's lovely.
Hi guys.
Hi, hello.
Hello, Maria. How's the plans for the house move going?
Oh, horrible. Everything is ready, waiting for us in England, and we're struggling to sell the house. So
Where are
we'll
you
get
now,
there.
Maria? Where are you now, Maria?
We are in Calgary right now, so we are waiting for the visa to come. We have to do the biometrics on Monday, and then continue with the marketing of the house.
Okay, best of luck with everything, with the move and everything.
Thank you, Peter.
Oh. Right, we'll give it another couple of minutes and then we start. Darren, can I suggest that the breakouts of maybe four or five or even 5 people, in case anybody needs to leave early or something like that. Three, it gets a little bit thin if there's only 3. I'll just go through the routine before, when I start the meeting, of what's going to happen, and looking
Can I
forward
just
to it.
say I may not be able to stay for breakouts? I assume that's following.
I understand.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've got
thank you.
guests.
And the third thing Jonathan's going to talk about is the current government. Is that the government last week or this week, Jonathan?
I don't think there's that big a difference, I'm afraid, Peter.
No, I have a feeling it's going to be much the same. Yes. Right.
I don't know. We have elections on Monday, so we'll see what kind of government we have Tuesday next week. Absolutely not necessary, but
yeah. So it's just after 7. I want to welcome all of our visitors, and of course, very pleased to have our own club represented here. The format of the meeting, that's the welcome bit. I'm going to do an introduction shortly to Jonathan, and Jonathan's asked to be interviewed rather than to give a presentation, and I'm going to hand over to Win, the club senior vice president, to do the interview. As soon as the talk's over, there's a chance to ask questions. Can I ask you, please, because I think there are going to be quite a few people here, if you have a question, could you put it in chat? And put it in chat to all rather than just to me. The advantage of that is if you see a question that's being asked that was what you were thinking of asking, then it saves you asking it. And the other advantage that it gives is if there is a great rash of questions, I'll put them in rank order with your permission. So the questions at the end, and then we go to a breakout. This is 10 minutes of what Darren, last year's president, calls our virtual bar. We go into a group of 4 or 5 people, and it's 10 minutes, and you'll see a sign coming up near the end of the 10 minutes when the breakout's ending, and we come back together for me to close the meeting. And tonight, for me as the president of the club, presidents get get privileges every now and then, and tonight is a rare privilege, to welcome somebody with such a reputation, such a record, and with such an interesting topic. Win and I, next year's president, and I have agreed that we'll have two priorities in the time of our presidency's peace and the environment, and there is no person better able to talk about peace and peacemaking than our speaker tonight, Jonathan Powell. Jonathan, who after his education and eventually joined the Foreign Office and was posted eventually to Washington. And one of the things that the Foreign Office, the diplomatic section of the Foreign Office in Washington was trying to do in the time of the Troubles was to keep the American government aware of the difficulty of the IRA. The IRA got rather too popular, I think. Well, we'll find out from our speaker. But one of his roles was to make sure that they understood the complexity of Northern Ireland. And so it was natural when Tony Blair asked him to join the staff at 10 Downing Street that he take a lead in the peace process. Rather than I go into too many of the details of it, you'll get that in part of the talk because he'll be speaking about Northern Ireland. I'm from Northern Ireland, so it's even more of a reason why it's a privilege for me. Just to explain how we ended up having Jonathan here on several occasions in the last 4 or 5 years, I've taken Jonathan and Sarah and their daughters, taken them sailing. And the last time that we went sailing, I said, why don't you come and talk to our Rotary Club? And at this point, sorry for the long introduction, but at this point, Win, if you could unmute, and I'll pass over to Win to take the rest of the session. Thank you, Jonathan, for coming.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great that you've come along to join us. Thank you so much. Well, this Tuesday coming is International Peace Day, which was established 30 years ago by the United Nations. So I'd like to talk about your insights into peace building. As a humanitarian organisation, peace is a cornerstone of Rotary's mission, and our commitment to peace building today answers new challenges, how we can make the greatest possible impact and how we can achieve our vision of lasting change. So I'd like to start with your insights into Europe. Within the EU, the zone of integration, there's been no conflict since 1945, which makes it the longest period of peace on the Western European mainland since Roman times. So my first question is, what do you think, or can I ask someone to switch their microphone off? That's fine, yes, before you start. What do you think the key factors have been to building this long peace?
Well, thank you, Win, and thank you, Peter, very much for inviting me. Peter, as he says, has been our captain several times and kept us safe in all sorts of circumstances. So the fact I'm still alive is down to Peter. So thank you for that. I think the essential point of the EU in the minds of its founders was to try and prevent the recurrence of war, which had dominated Europe in history for so long, and to learn the mistakes of the Versailles peace process. The Versailles peace process was a victor's justice, and it led to a peace that was never stable and led back into war very rapidly indeed. And I think they were wise enough to realize after the Second World War, firstly, the Americans were wise enough to realize they needed to stay in Germany and not pull out after a few months or a few years. They're wise enough to try and be inclusive in Germany. And the founders of the EU were wise enough to realize that they had to work together to find common economic interests which would stop them fighting each other instead of trying to separate out territory and get reparations and all the rest of it. And it turned out to be a really wise decision, and one I regret was not made enough of, in my view, in the European referendum. The case was made too much on purely economic issues, not enough on the fact that the EU had this extraordinary track record of maintaining peace in the European continent for a record amount of time. And the fact that it was able to expand ever eastward into the former Eastern European countries, for me, was particularly striking. I worked on the German unification process when I was in the Foreign Office, the 2+4. I was the sort of guy doing that in the Foreign Office. And it really struck me while we were working with the East Germans, while we were working with the Russians, and the influx of countries that came after that, how important it was to them to be able to join the European Union and to have the prospect of a lasting peace. Something I'd actually seen earlier, because my first posting as a diplomat was in Portugal, and Spain and Portugal, having escaped from the dictatorship of Franco and Salazar, or Caetano as it was later in Portugal, being able to join the EU underpinned their democracy as they gradually developed the post-fascist era. So I think the EU is fundamentally built on the principle, not so much of steel and coal, but steel and coal as a way of actually underpinning peace. And it's worked in a dramatically successful way. And it's only a tragedy that we haven't understood that fully in the United Kingdom.
So do you think the peace, apart from Brexit, do you think the peace is stronger now than it's ever been, or is it fragile? I suppose I'm thinking particularly of Hungary and places, and there's quite a lot of sort of anti-EU feeling.
Well, there is, and there was, and it came and went in Italy, for example. There was the populism that was anti-EU. Now the populists in Italy are no longer calling to leave the EU. So I think, actually, the way I see it is the EU has been fundamental in stopping what's happened in Hungary and Poland becoming completely disruptive of peace in Europe, because they were in the EU and because the EU had some lean on them through the organization itself. So far, anyway, what's happened in Poland and Hungary has not led to the threat of any sort of violence, the threat of any sort of disruption of peace. And I think it will make it possible, particularly in Hungary, where it seems to be going in that direction now, to move back towards a change of power. It looks as if the opposition in Hungary have finally got their act together enough. They will win in the next elections, and they will. And in those circumstances, I can't see how Orban could resist handing over power, despite the way that he's subverted the institutions. So again, I actually think the EU has contributed to making sure that what happened in Poland and Hungary, and even in Italy, with the rise of the populists, has not led to that kind of disruption of the peace on the continent that it might otherwise have done.
And do you think the rise of populism and the far right is still a real threat?
We may have seen the high watermark of populism. I hope so. I mean, the echoes of the 1920s and 30s are slightly alarming for anyone who thinks back to that era and how populism took the continent off the rails. I think it's important to always be on guard about populism and to hope that it doesn't take us that way and try and ensure that it doesn't. It only does when people, basically when good men do nothing. That's essentially the problem. It's not bad men who do, they're always bad men and they're always going to be doing what they do. But it's when the good men just give into it, as happened in Germany in the 1930s. And I hope that we've learned that lesson. And I hope that we've seen in America with Trump, and we're seeing in Europe that people are prepared to stand up and stop the slide in that direction. So I hope it's the high watermark of populism, but even if it isn't and we see another resurgence of it, I hope that the framework that has been built within the EU will stop that becoming a real threat. Of course, in the UK, we have a slightly different problem, because having left the EU, we now don't have those guardrails of the European Union, and our own constitution itself, which we always thought was very strong, is built on precedents, on understandings, on conventions, and is very vulnerable to people who are prepared to just dispense with those and ride roughshod over them, because we do not have a written constitution. We do not have those guide rails that other countries have. So potentially our situation is worse than the rest of Europe because we don't have that kind of protection.
Thank you. Well, now to Northern Ireland, where you played a crucial role in the peace talks that led to the Good Friday Agreement, which brought back power sharing, devolved government to Northern Ireland. I'm curious to know what it's like to be in that position. Is it all about hard bargaining? Is that at the heart of these talks? Or is it much more about the soft skills, you and your colleagues having sufficient emotional intelligence that acknowledges the hurt and anger that all sides, I was going to say both sides, but all sides must have felt when in bringing the parties together? I'm just interested to know the difference between the hard and the soft, really.
Yeah, the more I think about it, and since leaving government, I've spent my time working on conflicts around the world. So I set up an NGO called Intermediate, and for the past 11 years, wherever it is, I've been trying to deal with this. I think the view that I took in the end in Northern Ireland has been reinforced by my experience somewhere else. And that the key factor of a negotiation like that, like Northern Ireland, but actually pretty much all negotiations, is trust. And if you don't have trust, it's really very hard to negotiate. In Northern Ireland, the first time I met Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness at the end of '97, we actually had the meeting in a room in Stormont buildings, the office buildings at the bottom of the Stormont Hill in Northern Ireland, with Tony Blair meeting Adams and McGuinness. And we did it in a room deliberately with no windows, because a few weeks before, Mo Mowlam had been photographed shaking hands with the two of them through the window, and we didn't want that to happen. Alistair Campbell and I, who were at the meeting, refused to shake hands with Adams and McGuinness. Tony, who was much more grown up about it, did shake hands, and it's something I regret now. But the IRA had shot and injured my father in 1940 in Northern Ireland. They had put my brother, who worked for Mrs. Thatcher, on their death list for 8 years. And as Peter described, I spent a year in Washington trying to stop Jerry Adams getting a visa there, unsuccessfully in the end. So I didn't feel very warm and cuddly about the IRA. A little bit after that, I got a call out of the blue from Martin McGuinness at number 10. He called me up and he said, would I come to Northern Ireland and not tell the Securocrats? Just keep it to myself, by which he meant the police and the army. So I asked Tony Blair and he said, yes, you should go. So I did. I took a plane to Belfast International and a taxi to Derry. And I stood on a street corner feeling slightly foolish with a folded up copy of the Financial Times under my arm, until two guys with shaved heads turned up and pushed me into the back of a taxi saying, Martin sent us. And they drove me round and round Derry for about an hour. I was completely lost. Pushed me out of the taxi outside a little modern house on the edge of an estate. I completely lost my sense of bearings at that stage, but it must have been somewhere near the Bogside. And I knocked on the door, and Martin McGuinness came to the door on crutches and made a very unfunny joke about kneecapping, which was the IRA way of punishing people at the time, with drilling holes in their elbows, knees, and ankles. And we sat there for 3 hours in this house. The lady of the house had gone out and left some sandwiches and some tea. And we chatted, we made no breakthroughs. But it then occurred to me that if we were going to try and make peace in Northern Ireland, I had to try and build some trust with this guy. It was no good just inviting him to Downing Street or inviting him to Stormont Castle. I'd had to go onto their turf, take some shared risks, and gradually build that trust. So I then spent a good part of the next 10 years flying over to Northern Ireland at the same time as being Chief of Staff in Downing Street, and going to safe houses in Belfast and Dublin and Derry to sit with Adams and McGuinness and try and sort of win them over and them to win me over, to believe they could trust us enough to make peace. So I've come to the conclusion, and I've seen that so often since then in Colombia and other places that I work, that I do think that's a fundamental essence of any negotiation. And actually one of the reasons why we were so unsuccessful in the recent Brexit negotiations, because I think the British government destroyed trust in that process and actually ended up with a worse deal as a result.
Interesting. And do you think the Good Friday Agreement is in danger given the current ambiguities of Brexit?
Yes, and I mean, I certainly in danger. I don't think we're going back to the Troubles, personally. I'm probably doing a news night later tonight on this subject because it's come back on the agenda again with a speech by the DUP leader, Geoffrey Donaldson. I don't think we'll go back to the Troubles. I don't think this is so much a security problem now as a political problem, but it's a very serious political problem. The Good Friday Agreement was based on trying to put the issue of identity off the agenda. The issue of identity is always going to be crucial in Northern Ireland, but everything doesn't have to revolve around it. And why the border was so important, not having a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, was so people could feel Irish living in Northern Ireland, or they could feel British, or they could feel both. They could have an Irish passport, not a British passport. They could travel from Dublin. And so when we were able to remove the security fixtures along the border, and we were both members of the EU, that issue of identity became less important. And the arguments politically came about education, water rates, wood chips in the end, which was the downfall of Arlene Foster. And that was fundamental. And the trouble with Brexit was always going to be that it put the issue of identity back on the agenda. Because if we were going to leave the single market and the customs union, then there had to be a border somewhere. You can't have a customs union without a border. And we had a lot of nonsense from the Brexiteers saying, well, we'll have a technological border. Just because there are borders everywhere else in the world, we can have some magic situation in Ireland where there's no border. And that doesn't really work in practice. That's why it was so important to avoid a border in the island of Ireland, because putting a border there would have reopened that issue of identity between Republicans and Nationalists and Unionists. But by putting it in the Irish Sea, as many of us warned at the time, including Tony Blair and John Major when they campaigned in the referendum in Northern Ireland, you then, of course, affect the unionist identity. They want to be part of the United Kingdom. They don't want to have a border between two parts of their own country. And Boris Johnson very clearly knew that he was putting a border there. I've just done a review of the Michel Barnier's diaries of his time as negotiator, and it's very striking that it was very clear to him that Boris Johnson knew exactly what he signed up for. When he said there wouldn't be any checks, that was not a truthful statement, and he knew it not to be a truthful statement. So having put that border in the Irish Sea, he'd resolved the problem of the border in the Irish island of Ireland, but he created a new problem. The fact that we now have a lot of practical difficulties with that border, mainly relating to animal health and SPS provisions, makes it even worse, because people object to not being able to buy their sausages or their plants and all the rest of it. And then by the way that they've handled this issue and the threats that they've made to the EU, they've lost again the confidence of the EU to be able to make concessions. Well, they don't see the point of making concessions, because they make concessions and they get slapped in the face by the British government. And they've now marched the Unionist Party, the DUP, into a very unfortunate position with the speech that Geoffrey Donaldson made 2 days ago, where he said that they will pull down the government if they don't get rid of the protocol. And you can't get rid of the protocol but unless someone's got an alternative. And no one so far has suggested what an alternative to the protocol could be. So we're actually in a very serious situation now. And I always feared that the problem was going to be not a security one, Northern Ireland, it was going to be a political one. Because opinion polls show, and I think they're probably right, that the Sinn Féin will come out as the biggest party in the elections next year. And if they're the biggest party, they'll be the first minister. That shouldn't be a tragedy, because the first minister and deputy first minister are of equal status, but it will be for unionists to have a first minister who is from Sinn Féin. So I'm afraid if we lose the institutions, as we're in danger of doing now because of Brexit and because of the protocol, it'll be very, very hard to put them back up again. So I seriously worry about the political stability of Northern Ireland. And if we have political instability, we know that will lead to violence again. I don't believe it will be back to the Troubles, but it will just be a major problem again, which British politicians will have to spend their time thinking about.
Interesting insight, thank you. Now, thinking across to recent issues in Afghanistan with Taliban and IS, do you wish you had been around in 20 years ago after 9/11 to offer a similar strategy of that you did in the Good Friday Agreement, in actually talking to the enemy, talking to the Taliban and ISIS before the war began, and perhaps we wouldn't have been in the recent problem that we did end up in.
I have written about this actually last week in The Guardian and in the New Statesman, and unfortunately for me, the answer was I was around in 2001. I was in government, so I'm as responsible as anyone for not having that insight at the time. And for the last 2.5 years, I've been working with the Afghan government and with the negotiators in Doha, and Dr. Abdullah, who's still in, unlike President Ghani, who's still in Afghanistan. And yes, it was a mistake. There's no, I mean, I think any rational person would accept we made a mistake. There was an opportunity. After the Taliban collapsed in 2001, they sued for peace. They asked Karzai if they could just go back to their villages, settle down, and participate in Afghan society. And the American administration at the time took a decision that they would chase after the Taliban. They were not going to allow them to be reintegrated, and that they would kill them. And so, of course, they regrouped and started fighting. They went across the border into Pakistan, and then they got stronger and stronger. And that was just a mistake. That, again, it goes back to the Versailles notion. If you have victor's justice, if you don't go for an inclusive settlement in which people feel that they have a stake in the future, then you're just storing up trouble for yourself later. And that's what we learned in Northern Ireland. You know, we tried 3 times to make peace without Sinn Féin. So in '73 at Sunningdale, perfectly good agreement. In fact, Seamus Mallon, the SDLP politician, called the Good Friday Agreement Sunningdale for slow learners, because it had much the same measures in it as the agreement in 1998. But we didn't include Sinn Féin, and actually we didn't include the Loyalists, which actually principally brought that one down. Then in '85, Mrs. Thatcher came to the Anglo-Irish agreement with the Irish government, excluded all the political parties, and that failed. And then John Major, who deserves a lot of credit, by the way, on the whole peace process, really a lot, but his Downing Street Declaration failed because he also was trying to exclude Sinn Féin from it. And it was only in 98, once we included Sinn Féin, that we succeeded. And the same was true in Afghanistan. I fear the Taliban are on the verge of making the same mistake themselves. Now they're in power rather unexpectedly. They're a little bit like the dog that chased the car. They've got the car now and they don't quite know what to do with it, because governing a modern state is not amongst their many skills. So they're going to have a real problem. And the sensible thing for them to do would try and be to have reconciliation, try and bring people in, integrate certainly the other religions and ethnic groups, which they're not doing, into their government if they want it to last. And I don't think they understand that. And I think we're trying to work with many others to see if we can persuade them to understand that. And maybe they will over time, I hope so, because otherwise I fear that country will just tip back into another civil war.
So you're doing that with your trust intermediate?
Yeah, no, we're full-time. We work, that's what I do. And until recently, I was spending 75% of my time traveling and on the road doing these things. And we work in Venezuela and Burma, which is also not a very happy story, I'm afraid now. Afghanistan, Nigeria, and about 8 other countries.
Interesting, thank you. And lastly, I'd like to know what, in terms of peace building, the present government is doing right and wrong, in your view, as far as international relations are concerned anyway. Does the current government have a strategy that is conducive to peace building?
Well, I just think strategy and this government are 2 words that don't necessarily fit together very, very happily. And you may have noticed I'm not entirely a fan of theirs. I start with a bigger picture and come to actually answer the question about peace, but I do find Global Britain to be just a totally vacuous slogan with absolutely no content to it at all. And that is a problem for this country. Our foreign policy was built after the Second World War on 3 pillars. Churchill enunciated them. They were the empire, they were Europe, and they were the transatlantic relationship. Now, empire disappeared fairly quickly, but we were still left with 2 pillars, Europe and the United States. And they were really important because they interacted with each other. As far as we were in Europe, we were of interest to more interest to the United States. As far as we had a strong relationship with the United States, we were a greater player in Europe. We like to pretend we were a bridge, and to a certain extent we were a bridge between Europe and the United States. Once we kick away the European pillar from that, we no longer are a bridge. We no longer have that solidarity of the European Union. And if we then don't have a very strong relationship with the United States, as has been demonstrated over Afghanistan, for example, where we've been ignored, I mean, understandably, because we're not on the ground in the way the Americans were, we've got a real problem in our foreign policy. We don't actually have any reach. And I think that the document the government issued last year, which is actually rather well written by a young academic called John Bew, who works in Downing Street, is very good. But it had a bit of a gap in it. It didn't actually have any European policy in it. In fact, it devoted more words to relations with the Antarctic than it did to relations with Germany. And when asked by journalists, number 10, about European policy, number 10 answered the European policy was pending. And that's a bit of a problem if you're going to be a global player, because you have to start your policy with your neighbors. You have to have a European policy, a European strategy before you can have a global strategy. And I think just trying to pretend we don't have a relationship with our neighbors and we're going to have a global strategy is, to be honest, rather laughable. The notion that we're going to join ASEAN rather than the EU. I mean, ASEAN doesn't want us, and Malaysia doesn't want to join the EU because they live in Asia. And sending an aircraft carrier out there with American planes and protected by a Dutch frigate also isn't going to make us a power in Indo-Pacific. Even having a press conference announcing we support the Americans selling the Australians nuclear power stations. It may make us very unpopular in France and probably the EU more generally, but it isn't actually going to make us an Asian power. So I think until we have, going back to your first question, until we have a European strategy, until we're either the E3 with the Germans and the French, or better still with the EAS, the foreign policy aspect of the EU, if we have a relationship with that, we can then begin to build on it, and then we can contribute to peace. We would actually, if you want to make an advantage of Brexit and take advantage of our sovereignty, as we keep saying, then we could actually play a bigger role around the world in making peace. If we had that European crucial relationship to build on, then we could play a role in Nigeria or in Afghanistan and these other places. But until we have that firm foundation, I'm pretty skeptical that we can.
Well, thank you. I could listen to you all day, Jonathan, but let's invite some questions. So let me see. Andy asks, how do you feel about Liz Truss as a woman in her new position? I'm not sure why you've said as a woman, Andy, in her new position negotiating with the Taliban.
Well, I think it's actually a good thing to have a woman foreign secretary. We appointed the first in the form of Margaret Beckett, and I'm glad to see a female foreign secretary. And I think that's I'd like to actually see some rather more women in the cabinet, as elsewhere in the world. But anyway, that will probably happen. The trouble with Britain, I don't think there's a problem with Liz Truss talking to the Taliban as a woman. They're not going. The ones in Doha, who are the only ones we're talking to, and are savvy enough on PR to know that they need to be able to meet with women, and have been throughout the negotiations. There are actually some very strong and very impressive women in the government's negotiating team in Afghanistan. Fatima Gilani, notably, really prepared to stand up to Taliban and tell them what was what, which I really liked. I have no idea how Liz Truss will do as a foreign secretary. So far, her main thing in the trade negotiations has not been that dramatic, because all the trade agreements she's reached are simply copy and paste from the EU agreements. We haven't managed to get a single thing, I think, in addition to what existed in the agreements with the EU, which is not surprising, but is a little bit, doesn't necessarily show that she's going to be a great negotiator, but we shall see. I think Dominic Raab was really very misplaced in the job. It really, talking to people in the Foreign Office, it really didn't work. So I think it's lucky that he's gone. And Liz Truss may well do better from that point of view. Certainly she sees it as a staging post to becoming leader of the party. We'll see about that. But I think Britain is not well placed to play a big role in Afghanistan at the moment. We're not prepared to put our embassy back in, for example, in a way the EU probably isn't, where the Chinese and Russians have stayed in there. And there's a real problem in a lack of unity between the international community, because unless they have a united front to the Taliban, they're going to have very little influence on them. If the Chinese and Russians are prepared to support them, Pakistanis and Qataris, then what the US and UK and others say is going to count for very little.
Thank you.
Can I
Peter?
Win, can I take over?
Yes, sure.
Cletus, can I turn to you for your question? Unmute. Cletus, unmute and ask your question, please.
Oh, okay, right. My question is, now that we've signed a security pact with USA and Australia, just this morning I was hearing that, what is our relationship going to be with the EU and probably for the rest of the world?
Yeah, good question. I mean, what it's certainly done is made our relations with the French a whole lot worse. Having just allowed their very lucrative submarine contract with the Australians go out the window. One, by the way, we don't seem to be participating in. It seems to just be an American contract to sell them nuclear submarines, so we're not making anything out of it. But the French have sworn they're going to get their revenge. And the problem with what's happening in Northern Ireland is that where this is going to go, if we really walk away from the protocol, as they're threatening to do, is the EU will respond by trade sanctions of different sorts on us. And the French are really going to be gunning for us from that point of view. So, and if we get into a trade war with the EU, it's going to really be very difficult indeed, because we will lose more than they lose. So I really worry that they've done this without really thinking through the consequences for our relations with Europe and what's really in it for us, because we already have very good relations with the United States and excellent relations with Australia. We are not ourselves actually doing anything on this nuclear submarine. And Australia's problems are actually in the Pacific, where we have very little ability to do anything. So I fear that it's a bit more of a gesture. And there's an even bigger problem that I worry about that arises from this, which is, do we really want to put ourselves in a position of complete opposition to China? I mean, I'd be the first to condemn the Chinese for their actions with the Uyghurs and the others. And I think we should be tough on those issues, and Tibet as well, actually, from that point of view. But the rest of Europe is not going to line up with Biden against China. They're going to try and hover in the middle. So if we're throwing our lot in entirely with the Americans and with the Australians, who've also adopted a very hardline policy against China, and this disintegrates, and we've seen what happens before with declining powers when they start clashing with rising powers. Now, hopefully everyone's learned the lesson, so Taiwan will not be the thing that sparks that off. But is that really where we want to position ourselves? Have we thought that through properly? I'm not sure. Having made plenty of mistakes in government, from Iraq to all sorts of other things, I'm not sure how strong a position I am to condemn others, but I can certainly warn people that you need to think about things twice before you do them.
Mm. Can I turn to Douglas, please, for his question? Douglas, unmute and ask.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
Really interesting what you've been speaking about recently. And it was just a quick question regarding your thoughts on, we know your thoughts over the current government, but what your thoughts on my local MP's valiant effort in his previous ministerial role to protect veterans, especially those that were affected by the Troubles in Northern Ireland. That was MP Johnny Mercer.
Yeah. I'm not sure Johnny Mercer's approach to it was the best way to get what he wanted done in government, but anyway, he tried nobly to do it. I do have some sympathy with him and the government on this issue. It's the notion you could do this in a one-sided way just for the veterans, I think, was misguided. I mean, you can't in a successful peace process say, well, we're going to pardon one lot and not the other side. So that was never going to work. And we wrestled with this quite a bit in government ourselves. We tried to introduce a bill to deal with something called the on the runs, or a bunch of IRA people who'd never been convicted. And we needed to find a way of sort of drawing a line under that. And we did it by introducing legislation that would do it for on the runs and for security forces. And the Sinn Féin said they didn't support it, so we pulled it because that was a crucial stage of the peace negotiations. And yet we do need to find some way of avoiding Northern Ireland and ourselves getting dragged back into history all the time by the prosecution of the veterans, of the police, but also of the terrorists. Because if we're going to do this, we have to do it both ways. You know, remember a few years ago, Jerry Adams got arrested and interrogated for 3 days. It makes the peace process really vulnerable if that's going to happen, if you're going to have soldiers who are really, you know, quite old now, a long time after the event. There's very little chance of them being successfully prosecuted because the evidence is all, and if there is a successful prosecution, it will be a result of luck. So it will be because there is a new bit of forensic evidence. So I think the government is right to try and find a way to put this stuff behind us as best we can without sort of a complete, what we had in effect was a sort of amnesty because everyone got out after 2 years under what we agreed in the Good Friday Agreement. I think they would be right to try and find a way of drawing that line, but it certainly provoked a reaction, and all the Northern Ireland parties are completely opposed, as is the Labour Party. At least they're opposed in public. Actually, in private, they're less opposed. But I think the government's right to try and find a way of doing this. They've done it in a rather cack-handed way by not consulting people as they went along. They'd have been more sensible to consult the victims groups, to consult the parties in Northern Ireland and built this up. So I think they did it the wrong way. They're trying to do the right thing. And what they do next, you know, they've just been taken to the UN on this issue, and it probably is justiciable internationally at the International Criminal Court. So I think it's going to, I think a few chapters to run on the story.
Thank you. Nigel, your question? Unmute, please. Nigel, unmute, please.
Yeah, right. I'm with you now, I think. I want to ask a question about the financial implications of the SNP independence requirements, particularly as I see it, they would have to take over around about 1/5 of the national 2.5 billion trillion debts that this country currently has. They need to form a bank, and if they start off with
okay, thank you.
A substantial debt, they're not going to get very good rates like this country as a whole has. I'd like to know more about Jonathan's thoughts on the whole subject. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, on that specific, I don't think I have expertise, but the point you make, I do have some views on, which is I think there's some very serious issues about independence for Scotland that have never been properly aired. Most of them are economic and financial of different sorts. I mean, I was walking on Hadrian's Wall this summer, and you know, if you had to put the border back in Hadrian's Wall, the border in Northern Ireland is going to look quite simple by comparison. How do, if they go into the EU and we're outside the EU, so Northern Ireland's in the single market sort of, and Scotland is, it's going to become very, very messy. The issue of the currency itself, what are they going to do with the currency? As you say, what are they going to do about reserves and debt? How are they going to actually manage the economy for such a small... The trouble is they're allowed to escape all those questions as long as Boris Johnson just says, you can't have a referendum, you can't have a referendum. In a way, he's their best friend for the independentists, because they can simply campaign on saying you're denying us our democratic rights and we're allowed to have a say on whether or not we should be independent. So they don't actually want a referendum at the moment because they'd probably lose it. They'd like to be in the situation saying we want a referendum and you're stopping us doing it, because that will knock their support up. That's why it's actually going up in the opinion polls at the moment. And it won't be sustainable in the long term. Sooner or later, either before or after Boris Johnson goes, whoever is prime minister is going to have to agree to a referendum. And by that stage, you may have made support for independence really very strong indeed. But at some stage, they're going to have to answer those economic questions that you raise. And so far, they're able to avoid it very neatly because they're being sheltered by what Boris Johnson is doing. And by the way, there's an interrelationship between what happens in Northern Ireland on a border poll and in Scotland on a referendum, because we are compelled by law to have a border poll on a united Ireland if the Secretary of State believes there is a majority for it. Now, there isn't. The opinion polls still show there is no majority for a united Ireland, but it is moving in that direction, demographically, politically, and in every other way. And if we find ourselves agreeing to a referendum in Northern Ireland, I don't see how we're going to say no to a referendum in Scotland. But I agree with you that there is some big economic questions that so far the Scot Nats have got a way of answering at all.
Brilliant, Jonathan. Thank you. Can I, Chairman's privilege, I'm very interested in your intermediate work, and I listen to the countries you talk about, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Venezuela. Rank order them for us and tell us the one that is most likely to get easy to be solved and the one at the bottom that's got the most problems.
Trouble is that changes quite a lot. I mean, we have succeeded in some places like Colombia, which took 8 years, 8 years of my involvement, with ETA in Spain and with Mozambique. But the current ones we're working on, I think none of them are very optimistic, but I think Venezuela, there is a chance. We have at least started negotiations last week between the Maduro regime and the opposition. We worked with the opposition on that, trying to help them in the negotiations. The Maduro regime has no intentions at the moment of agreeing to free and fair elections for the presidency, but they're in a bit of trouble. A couple of their key people have been arrested, one in Cabo Verde and one in Spain, and they're feeling the pressure, and the negotiations are making some progress. I don't give that much chance of success, but that's probably at the top. Yeah. The one that's worrying me as the most difficult at the moment is probably Myanmar, Burma. When we were working with Aung San Suu Kyi on the peace negotiations between the 20 armed groups that have been fighting there against the army for 60 years, and we were making progress until the coup happened. The trouble is the army has very little inclination to compromise, and the opposition now, unfortunately, also they've declared war on the army, and they're now guerrillas in the field fighting them. So I fear that's going to go through quite a long period of suffering, and everywhere else from Ethiopia to South Thailand. Actually, maybe South Thailand I'd put up at the top too. South Thailand's a rather nasty little war people don't know about, which is the Muslim bit of Thailand where the guerrillas have been killing, well, they were killing 3,000 a year. It's down now, but they were killing a lot of people. No one much cared about it. It's in a sort of peace process now. The violence is right down, and I think there is a chance of success there. The trouble is Thai politics at the moment is very tied up, but coin a phrase, but yeah, I think that would probably be a possible chance as well.
That's brilliant. I'm like Win. I could talk to you all evening. Please, can I hand over to a member of our club, Jonathan, for a vote of thanks. Sarah.
Yes, thank you, Peter. And thank you very much, Jonathan. That's really been fascinating to hear you speaking, and to be able to hear your thoughts on such a wide-ranging number of topics. And I can see, I look forward to hearing more about intermediate and how that work is developing. And I think the main thing that's staying with me is that contrast you drew between, the Versailles version of peacemaking, which is victor's justice, and the version that you've somehow managed to articulate, which I think is amazing, which is about negotiation and is about listening and hearing the other side, and however difficult and complicated that is, trying to find some way to meet each other and see each other as human beings. So I thank you for that, and I hope we will be able to hear from you again, perhaps some more about intermediate. But in the meantime, I'd just like to ask my friends and colleagues to please show their appreciation in the usual way. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much.
And what we do now, Jonathan, is that at random, we're going to, there's about 20 screens at the moment, maybe more, and we go into groups of 4 or 5 for 10 minutes. And I invite everybody actually to reflect on your talk and to discuss in your breakout room, what did you not realize? What did you not know happened when you were doing peace work? And we'll take a very quick run round just before the end of the meeting after 10 minutes. So what happens now is Darren clicks a button, you're invited to join a breakout room. And if you don't click yes, you're going to be left on your own.
Right. I'll remember to click.
And somebody lucky is going to be in Jonathan's group. Goodbye.